Welcome to video 7 in our series of developing a theoretical framework, how to develop a theoretical framework. In this video, I'll discuss the process of building a rigorous theoretical framework of your empirical research. By the end of this video, you will have a 9-step process for developing your own theoretical framework for your research. Let me start by clarifying what a theoretical framework is and is not. A theoretical framework is often described as the blueprint for your study. It provides the structure and the guidance, much like architectural plans guide the construction of a house. A well-crafted theoretical framework anchors your study, guides what data to collect, and connects to how you will analyze and interpret the data. A theoretical framework can rest on one single established theory, or it can integrate multiple theories by weaving their core constructs and relationships into a framework that better explains the phenomenon you are investigating. A theoretical framework is not a simple literature review that can wander in all directions. Rather, it's a targeted investigation that organizes the complex reality of your topic and explains the relationships between key constructs. It prevents you from being overwhelmed by the full-blown complexity of a phenomena you are studying. In other words, the theoretical framework helps distill chaos into clarity by synthesizing ideas into a coherent explanation of how and why things occur. Importantly, a theoretical framework frames your study's approach and assumptions. It draws on established theories and evidence, which are the wisdom of giants in your field, rather than just your personal or other people's opinions. Every aspect of an empirical study, from the problem statement and purpose to the research design, data analysis, and interpreting your findings, they all should align with the theoretical framework. The first step in developing any theoretical framework is to read voraciously and extensively. You should read not only the literature in your own field, but also reach beyond the confines of your immediate field. This is why each week in this semester, you will have a required reading and learn 3 well-established theories in leadership. This process exposes you to a lot of leadership theories, constructs, and relationships. Without extensive reading, you will have no idea where to start when developing a theoretical framework. The breadth of literature provides the necessary foundation, the construction materials to identify relevant theories, understand their applications, and recognize the patterns across different contexts. In this process, I don't recommend using AI to summarize those articles because you will lose the critical process of developing a deep understanding of those materials. The very process of wrestling with complex ideas, synthesizing information, and making connections between constructs cannot be replicated through AI-generated summaries. More importantly, extensive reading serves as the foundation to become an effective writer. The exposure to diverse writing styles, theoretical arguments, and scholarly discourse develops your ability to articulate complex ideas clearly and persuasively. This is why I still read an article every single day. English is my second language, but I've been able to publish about 40 peer-reviewed articles and 3 books in English. If I can accomplish this in my second language, you can achieve it in your first language with much ease, as long as you put in time and effort into this reading and writing process. If you take the shortcut, I can tell from your writing, no gradual progression of ideas, no topic sentences, no evidence to support your arguments, and so on and so forth. AI can generate a summary, but it does not mean you understand the article. Understanding requires your own intellectual labor, so don't cheat yourself. After you master the literature in your own field, You will need to read literature outside your immediate field because innovation often happens at the intersections of ideas. Immerse yourself in diverse literatures, including theories from psychology, sociology, economics, philosophy, and neuroscience. Exposes yourself to new perspectives, analogies, and insights that can spark creative theoretical ideas. For example, you want to study how school principals nurture innovation in their schools. If you only read educational leadership literature, you limit yourself to the theory of instructional leadership. But if you cast a wider net, you read organizational psychology research on creative climate. From neuroscience, you gain insights into how novelty boosts engagement. From sociology, you understand the role of organizational culture. This extensive reading helps you uncover a theoretical tension. Traditional school leadership theories emphasize order and accountability, but innovation thrives on flexibility and risk-taking. Recognizing this tension, which you may have missed without cross-disciplinary reading, becomes a clue toward a new theoretical framework. Reconciling those forces, your extensive reading, therefore, lays the groundwork for an innovative theoretical framework, perhaps integrating constructs from multiple fields. Step 2. Challenge assumptions and spot theoretical tensions. As you read the literature, don't accept everything at face value. Challenge assumptions and look for theoretical tensions or contradictions. Many theories' assumptions are not explicitly stated. You need to think critically and read between the lines to identify what the authors take for granted. Theoretical frameworks emerge from questions like, what if the prevailing wisdom is incomplete? Or why do findings A and B conflict? This process requires critical and reflective thinking. Ask, what are the hidden assumptions in dominant theories? Are there paradoxes or unexplained anomalies in the literature? Pay special attention to unstated premises that underlie theoretical arguments. Those implicit assumptions often represent the most fertile ground for theoretical innovation. Identifying those tensions is key to carve out a space for a new theoretical framework. Let's say you notice there is an assumption in literature that charismatic leaders always improve organizational performance. It sounds logical. Who wouldn't want a visionary, charismatic leader? But as you observe in your own professional settings, you notice some high charisma leaders actually cause a lot of organizational chaos, which is an anomaly. This tension between the expectation and the reality is intriguing. Here, you spot a theoretical tension. Could it be that charisma yields short-term enthusiasm, but sometimes undermines long-term stability? This prompts you to challenge the assumptions that charisma is uniformly positive. Perhaps the missing piece is followership dynamics or organizational culture. You then question the assumption and discover that charisma's effect may depend on factors like team cohesion or oversight. This process sets you up to propose a new theoretical framework where charismatic leadership interacts with organizational context in complex ways. With a broad critical view of the literature, you will start homing in on the core constructs that will be included in your theoretical framework. Step 3 is to identify and clearly define your key constructs. Constructs, or related terms of concepts or variables, are the building blocks of the theory. For example, job satisfaction, community engagement, transformational leadership, and trust are all constructs. They're the building blocks in your theoretical framework. It's not enough to name those constructs. You must precisely articulate what each construct means in your study's context. Ambiguous or ill-defined constructs are a common flaw in theoretical frameworks, and this flaw leads to confusion and weak explanatory power of your theoretical framework. In my previous video on ambiguous constructs, I explained in detail how you should clearly define constructs. Feel free to rewatch that video to refresh your memory. Every theoretical framework operates within certain boundary conditions, the context, population, and conditions under which you expect your theoretical framework to hold true, and by extension, where it may not apply. Step 4 is about explicitly clarifying the boundaries and the scope of your theoretical framework. This includes asking who, where, and when. Who does this framework apply to? In what context or environments? Under what conditions or time frames? You need to describe the boundary conditions by situating your theoretical framework and protect it from overgeneralization. For example, you develop a theoretical framework to explain team innovation in organizations, and you propose that diverse teams, which means team members have a wide variety of expertise, are more innovative due to cross-fertilization of ideas. But what are the boundary conditions? Maybe this holds in creative industries, but not in highly routine industries. Or maybe it works in short-term project teams, but not in long-standing teams where diversity in expertise could cause conflicts over time. As you specify the boundary conditions of your theoretical framework, you can say the theoretical framework is bounded by a relatively egalitarian team culture, which is common in Western contexts, but in high power distance cultures, the dynamics may be different. In doing so, you not only set clear expectations, but also provide a roadmap for future researchers to test your theoretical framework's limits. For example, someone may later study if your theoretical framework holds in a non-Western context. Now we get to the heart of building a theoretical framework, explaining the how and the why. In step 5, you explore possible mechanisms and pathways that connect your key constructs. A mechanism is essentially the process or engine that makes a relationship work. If you propose that X influences Y, ask, through what mechanisms does X lead to Y? Or what is the pathway of influence? You often need to introduce mediating variables or detailing the chain of effects. It's about opening the black box between the cause and effect. In developing a theoretical framework, identifying mechanisms transforms a set of constructs into an explanatory narrative. It is not enough to say leadership influences performance or policy change improves outcomes. A robust theoretical framework will propose how leadership influences performance, for example, by increasing employees' motivation or clarifying goals, or why policy changes lead to certain outcomes, for example, by changing stakeholders' incentives or resources. Those mechanisms are often drawn from disciplines like psychology, economics, sociology, which speaks to our first step of interdisciplinary reading. You borrow explanatory mechanisms from foundational sciences. Sociology offers a mechanism like social pressure or norm diffusion. Psychology may offer cognitive biases or motivation as a mechanism. Neuroscience may even contribute dopaminergic reward pathways in the brain as a mechanism for habit formation. Mechanisms also include mediators and moderators in formal theorizing. A mediator explains how X influences Y, which is part of the causal chain. A moderator explains when the relationship holds, which links back to boundary conditions. At this stage, focus on mediating pathways. Weave your constructs together in a logical sequence. For example, you develop a theoretical framework to explain organizational behavior. You propose flexible work arrangement, which is X, leads to high employee productivity, which is Y. What is the mechanism? You may posit that flexible work arrangements increase job satisfaction and work-life balance, which is your mechanism A, which in turn boosts intrinsic motivation. That's your mechanism B, which leads to employees to be more productive. Here, Job satisfaction and motivation are mediating constructs that form the pathway from X to Y. You flesh out why each link exists. Flexibility gives employee autonomy, which is backed by self-determination theory from psychology. Autonomy increases satisfaction, which is backed by the literature on autonomy. Satisfied employees are more motivated and engaged, which is backed by motivation theory. Motivated employees exert more effort or creativity, which raises productivity. This is backed by performance theory. So your theoretical framework is not just flexibility leads to productivity, but it provides a richer explanation. Flexibility leads to autonomy, to satisfaction, to motivation, and to productivity, with each arrow justified by logic and prior empirical evidence. By this point, you likely have the skeleton of your theoretical framework. You have your key constructs, their definitions, and an idea of how they connect with mechanisms. Step 6 is about situating your theoretical framework in the landscape of existing theories and making clear how your theoretical framework differs or adds value. In essence, you must answer what is new here and how does it relate to what's already being said. This requires a comparison and contrast with established theories that are relevant to a topic. Situating your theoretical framework serves two purposes: contextualization and differentiation. Contextualization means you show you are not reinventing the wheel ignorantly. You acknowledge major theories related to a topic. Differentiation means you clarify what gap or limitation in existing theories you are addressing and what synthesis you are offering that has not been done before. You need to explain how is your theoretical framework different from X theory or Y model that we've already known. Maybe your theoretical framework integrates two schools of thought that were previously separate. Maybe your theoretical framework extends a theory into a new context with tweaks to constructs or mechanisms. Maybe your theoretical framework challenges a dominant theory with an alternative explanation. Be explicit about this contribution. You acknowledge the strength of existing theories, but also point out where they fall short for your research problem. That is your opening. For example, you can write, whereas prior theory A explains a phenomenon under conditions P and Q, it does not account for my theoretical framework integrates R and therefore provides a more comprehensive explanation of the phenomenon. This writing signals a legitimate scholarly contribution. Let's say your work is in organizational governance and you are developing a new theoretical framework for governance board effectiveness. There is an existing theory, say agency theory, which explains board behavior in terms of principals and agents, which are owners and managers, and focuses on control and monitoring. There is also resource dependency theory that frames boards as providers of resources and connections. You propose a theoretical framework that adds a new dimension, perhaps board social capital theory. Let's say your board social capital theory focuses on how relationships and trust among board members and stakeholders enhance effectiveness. In step 6, you situate your theoretical framework by saying, unlike agency theory, which emphasizes oversight, my framework highlights relational mechanisms, trust network ties as key to board effectiveness. Resource dependence theory acknowledges the importance of board connections to external resources, but my framework builds on that by detailing how internal social capital among board members translates to adaptive capacity. You may illustrate where your theoretical framework overlaps with existing ones. For example, you also consider resource access like resource dependence theory does, but also where it goes further by introducing trust dynamics, which neither agency theory nor resource dependence theory cover. By doing so, you carve out intellectual space. This is how to view governance boards through a new lens. You then cite the canonical sources for agency theory and resource dependence theory when making those comparisons to show the scholarly grounding of your theoretical framework. Here is another example in educational leadership. A well-known theory is transformational leadership, which focuses on inspiring change in followers. You develop a theoretical framework, let's say, I'm making things up, contextual leadership in schools. In your theoretical framework, you add that leadership effectiveness depends on contextual factors like community engagement and school culture. You differentiate your theoretical framework from transformational leadership by stating that transformational leadership theory provides a general explanation of visionary leadership. However, when applied to schools, transformational leadership overlooks community context. My theoretical framework addresses this gap by integrating theories of community capital. Thus, where transformational leadership focuses on leader-follower relationships, my theoretical framework expands to leader-community relationships, which is a gap in the existing literature. You are not just repackaging old ideas, you are contributing something new to the field. With your theoretical frameworks, step 7 is about tightening the connections. You need to ensure your constructs are linked together with rigorous logic, and where possible, you draw on empirical evidence for support. Essentially, you are now weaving the narrative of your theoretical framework. For example, you can say, construct A is related to B because logical rationale and evidence from previous study shows X, Y, Z, which align with this logic. Each linkage in your theoretical framework should be justified by rigorous reasoning, which is your theoretical logic, and ideally by citing empirical findings, which is your empirical grounding. These steps turns your theoretical framework into a coherent, compelling argument rather than just a speculation. Logical coherence is key. It means there are no internal contradictions and the reasoning flows. Check your theoretical framework for consistency. Do all the pieces fit together in a way that makes sense? Are there any leaps of faith where you assume a connection without explanation? If so, fill those gaps with rationale. Sometimes using because of statements helps. A influences B because if you can complete that sentence clearly for each relationship, you have your logic. If you struggle, you may need to refine your mechanism or constructs. Empirical grounding means anchoring your theoretical claims in what is already known from existing research. Although your theoretical framework may be new, it's likely each link or component has some support in existing studies. You should cite those existing studies. How do you know that? You do it from your literature review. For example, if your theoretical framework posits that social support reduces employee burnout, you cite studies or meta-analysis that have found similar relationships. For example, social support has been empirically associated with lower burnout, followed by author A 2019. This does not prove your theoretical framework, which may be more complex, but it shows that part of the relationship rests on the foundation of evidence, which lends credibility. It's similar to building a legal case. You're citing legal precedents to support your arguments. At the same time, you'll need to maintain a balance. Your theoretical framework may also include new links that have not been tested empirically yet. That's what makes it an original contribution. In those cases, you rely on strong logical reasoning and perhaps analogous evidence. It's okay if parts of your theoretical framework are untested. That becomes an opportunity for your empirical research to provide evidence to either support or refute your theoretical framework. But you still must explain why you believe those parts should hold. For example, you develop a theoretical framework that argues pronounced hierarchical differentiation undermines team psychological safety, which in turn reduces team performance. So here's the logic of relationships among your constructs. Tall hierarchies refer to organizational structures with multiple levels between frontline employees and top leadership, such as team leads, supervisors, middle managers, directors, associate directors, and executives. The tall hierarchies fragment information channels, amplify status anxiety, and make it costly for lower status members to voice concerns, lower team members' psychological safety without the freedom to question, correct, or innovate. The team's learning cycles stall and leadership quality erodes, which leads to poor team performance. To establish empirical grounding, you then cite a meta-analysis of 13,000 teams, and the meta-analysis study found that hierarchy exerts a small but significant negative effect on team effectiveness and raise conflict levels. Complementing this, you then cite another meta-analysis study to show that psychological safety uniquely explains variance in both task performance and citizenship behaviors across teams. Together, they substantiate the chain from hierarchy to low psychological safety to low team performance. Why do I prefer meta-analysis in my citations? I'll explain this in my next video on hierarchy of evidence. Now, come back to theoretical framework. A second pathway in the same theoretical framework may propose that distributed leadership restores clarity and mutual influence, thereby offsetting the performance penalties of hierarchy. And you cite another meta-analysis to link distributed leadership to improved organizational outcomes as the evidence supporting that a flatter organizational structure can improve team performance. Putting it together, a write-off may read something like this. Hierarchical layering is expected to reduce team outcomes because status gaps constrain open dialogue and heighten evaluation apprehension. A meta-analysis of 54 studies covering more than 13,000 teams suggests that hierarchy carries a measurable performance cost. Author A, 2024. Lower psychological safety, shown by author B, 2017, would be a robust predictor of task performance, provides the intervening mechanism. Therefore, I hypothesize that flattening formal ranks or adopting distributed leadership styles will offset those effects consistent with evidence that distributed leadership improves organizational performance. Notice how this paragraph weaves causal reasoning, status gaps constrain dialogue, therefore safety falls, with empirical evidence, which turns your writing into an evidence-based narrative. Theoretical frameworks often benefit from a visual representation. In step 8, you convert your narrative theoretical framework into a diagram. Why visualize your theoretical framework? Because a well-crafted visual can encapsulate complex relationships in an accessible way. It serves as a cognitive aid for both you and your readers. It forces you to be clear about the components and their connections. It is difficult to draw a diagram of a modeled idea, and a diagram allows others to quickly grasp your theoretical framework. Think of how your brain processes information. We are highly visual creatures. A diagram can sometimes show gaps or unnecessary elements that were not obvious in text. It also helps ensure parsimony, which means simplicity, because when you draw it out, you may realize if something is overly convoluted. Visualizations are common in journal articles. For this reason, they turn dozens of lines of text into one figure that can be more easily remembered and critiqued. There are many ways to visualize a theoretical framework. You can use box and arrows, you can use logic models, you can use a flowchart, or even creative metaphors like showing your theoretical framework as scales or pillars, if that suits it. But typically, a straightforward diagram with labeled boxes which represent your constructs, and arrows or lines, which represent your relationships, is effective. Ensure every arrow or line in the diagram is explained by your step 7 logic, and every box is defined from step 3 constructs. When you include the visualization, you'll need to guide the reader through it in your writing. For example, in figure 1, the leftmost box represents X, the arrow indicates the causal flow, the dashed line denotes a moderating effect. With the theoretical framework developed and visualized, the final step is to reflect on how your theoretical framework informs your research methods, specifically data collection and data analysis. A strong theoretical framework should align with the way you plan to investigate your topic. This step closes the loop between theory and method. It ensures congruence or alignment between what you think theoretically and what you will do practically in your study. Ask yourself, given my theoretical framework, what kind of data will I need to collect to examine those constructs and relationships? And how will I analyze the data in light of the framework? For quantitative studies, this means identifying what variables correspond to each construct and what instruments or measure to use. It means deciding on the unit of analysis. Are you measuring at the individual level, group level, or organizational level as implied by your theoretical framework? It also means choosing analysis, for example, regression structural equation modeling, that tests the relationships you proposed in your theoretical framework. For qualitative studies, it means determining what phenomena or behaviors to observe and who to interview about what your interview questions would be, or what text to analyze such that you can see the constructs and the mechanism in action. It also guides analytic strategies. For example, using your theoretical framework as a priori coding scheme for qualitative data, or see if new codes emerge that challenge your theoretical framework. Importantly, the theoretical framework should hint at what evidence would support or refute it. This reflection ensures your study is set up to actually provide insights on your theoretical framework. There is a saying, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you build a theoretical hammer, make sure your research is looking for nails and not something else. If your theoretical framework includes organizational hierarchy, psychological safety, and team performance, then you should not collect data on transformational leadership or leader personality traits. Your theoretical framework can also suggest methodological choices. For example, if your theoretical framework includes process over time, you may need a longitudinal design. If it includes understanding internal states, maybe mixed methods, this final step also highlights any potential pitfalls in your research design. For example, if one of your constructs is hard to measure, you may want to refine it or acknowledge the limitation. If your theoretical framework is very complex, maybe you should focus on a part of it in your first study and then move on to a different part in your second study. All this is part of reflecting and aligning. Here is an example. If your theoretical framework posits social networks of leaders influence knowledge sharing and innovation among teams, you know you need data on social networks and innovation outcomes. So implication is that you conduct a social network analysis, which is a research method, by surveying leaders about their social ties, and then measure innovation, perhaps via new program count or the number of new ideas generated in their teams. You may also do qualitative interviews to understand how ideas flow, because your theoretical framework talks about mechanisms of knowledge sharing. Perhaps you gather narratives about how a new idea is spread from one individual to another. In data analysis, if quantitative, you may use network metrics. For example, network density or centrality and regress them on innovative outcomes. If qualitative, you may use theoretical constructs as initial codes. For example, trust as a code if your theoretical framework says trust in network ties is important. And then you see if the data supports that or uncovers new aspects. One final note. Developing theoretical frameworks is an iterative, reflective process. You will not get it right on the first try. You will swap construct A for construct B. You will rearrange your arrows in the diagram. You may move multiple constructs around as you gain a better understanding of the mechanisms. It is common that I revise my theoretical frameworks repeatedly, sometimes over 20 times or even 50 times in some of my theoretical papers. The theoretical framework evolves as your understanding evolves. As you collect data, you may find you need to adjust your theoretical framework. That is normal. Be open to that and embrace this iterative process. Now, your task is to follow the 9 steps that I've introduced in this video to start developing your own theoretical framework for your empirical research.